Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this press briefing with IATA. Thank you very much for joining us. We've taken a bit of a break over the northern summer period. Today we have our July passenger and cargo traffic statistics to announce. And to do that, we've got Willie Walsh, our Director General, who'll make some general comments, short presentation, and then we'll throw it open to questions and answers. We also have our Chief Economist, Marie Owens-Thompson, who's also available here to answer questions during the Q&A period, which will take place using the chat function. So please type your questions into the chat function when you have them. In the meantime, I'd like to turn it over to Willie to take us through an analysis of what happened in July traffic.
Okay, thank you, Tony, and good afternoon, everybody. I just have a very short presentation for you to give you a quick update on what we're seeing in July. The good news is the recovery continues and passenger recovery is gaining momentum. And as you would expect, we continue to see growth in both the domestic and the international markets. The July figures show that the cargo business is still roughly around where it was in 2019. I think solid performance from cargo. Domestic has seen a strong recovery, principally due to China, the domestic market in China rebounding, and I'll show you some figures on that in a moment. With international traffic now at 32% down on where it was in 2019. Overall, we're at about 75% of where we were in 2019. So making a solid recovery as we go through the summer season in the Northern Hemisphere. Next chart, please. So you can see cargo, this is seasonally adjusted index back to January of 2020, but I think it shows you the continuing strong performance for the cargo business. We've seen very strong performance in Latin America in July. There is some disruption still because of the war in Ukraine. That's taken a lot of capacity out of the European market. And we continue to see some disruption in supply chains. But in general, cargo performance continues to perform well, slightly down in July and where it was in July of 2019. And now moving on to the next slide. You can see here in the domestic markets that very strong V-shaped recovery that I mentioned in China. That's the red bar, the one at the bottom there. So domestic markets continue to perform well. So it's very encouraging to see that China is beginning to move again internally, at least. And I think that's hopefully a sign of positive developments in relation to China. But all domestic markets are performing strongly now as we go through 2019, the rest of 2022 versus 2019. And the next slide. So this shows the international traffic, and you can see there the Asia Pacific region lagging significantly behind. If I look at, again, this is seasonally adjusted going back to January of 2020. But if I look at July, traffic within the Asia Pacific region was at about 35% of where we were in 2019. And looking at some of the major traffic lanes from Asia, within Asia, it's at about 25% of where it was in 2019. Europe to Asia is just under 40%, about 38%. We're seeing Middle East to Asia picking up now at about 68%, but it's the area of the world that's lagging most behind. We're seeing good, steady progress in other regions. This chart we've shown before, and what you can see here is the very high, what we call crack spread. That's the difference between the basic Brent oil price and the jet oil price. And this is at levels that I don't recall ever seeing before. I think last week the crack spread was about 50%. I look back over the 10-year period up to 2019, where it averaged about 17%. And as you know, fuel represents the single biggest cost in an airline's cost base. So although you've seen the Brent oil price ease a little, jet oil prices are still very strong, very elevated, and that will continue to put pressure on airline cost base as we go through the rest of the year. We had expected this crack spread to reduce as more jet fuel supply became available, but clearly the recovery in demand is stronger than the recovery in the production of jet fuel, and hence that elevated crack spread that we're witnessing. So hopefully we'll see this moderate a little bit as we go through the rest of the year, but clearly it is a challenge for all airlines. We do see some hedging in the industry, and I'm aware of some airlines that have embarked on hedging in recent months where they hadn't been previously hedged, just to provide themselves with some protection against the volatility that we're witnessing in the jet oil prices at the moment. So that's the presentation. You know, we are seeing, oh, sorry, this one last slide, yeah, which I think supports what we've been saying. You know, strong forward bookings, you can see there, the international in red, domestic in blue. So the recovery is gaining some momentum. We've seen good traffic figures through the peak summer in Northern Hemisphere. Domestic markets now recovering well with the increased activity in the Chinese domestic market. And we expect this now to continue into the August and September figures that we'll show, given the positive trends that we're seeing in forward bookings. So I think a good story, both on the passenger and cargo side of the business, and clearly, you know, some challenges ahead, particularly with the fuel price, but positive outlook for the industry at the moment. Back to you, Tony.
Okay, thank you, Willie. Just a reminder to all those listening in, if you have questions, please submit them through the chat function. We'll take them in order. As people are typing in, perhaps we'll start with one question, Willie, which is, we had a summer with a lot of headlines about operational challenges at various airports. Do you think the worst is behind us now?
I think in most airports it should be. You know, certainly the pace of recovery was faster than most people had expected. I know there's been some comments about Eurocontrol projections on flights and that the recovery has pretty much followed the Eurocontrol projections. But I think when you drill down into some of the Eurocontrol stats, what you're seeing is the recovery in overall traffic is a mix of strong business jet activity, strong cargo activity, and steady recovery in the low cost and network segments. But clearly it has been a stronger rebound than some people had expected, and the lag in getting people back into the system, particularly in areas where additional security checking was required, has caused some problems at airports, but I think it is coming under control. Heathrow continues to struggle based on the data that they've produced for July. Haven't seen the August figures yet. And I think it's important to point out that while Heathrow blames airlines, really the problem lies clearly with Heathrow, because the security queuing times there have been appalling as we've gone through June and July, with the lowest levels that I've ever seen. You know, T5 in July for passenger security checks was at 39% against a target of 95%, so an abysmal performance on the part of Heathrow. So I think more honesty is required before we can fix the problem. I think people have to face up to the nature of the problem that we're facing at the moment. But I think it is going to get better as we go through the rest of the year, and clearly we are going into a period in Europe where demand for travel would normally ease off.
Okay, thank you, Willie. We have a question, actually a few questions from Hong Kong. The questioner notes that Hong Kong has not lifted its travel restrictions, particularly it maintains its hotel quarantine requirements. And the questioner asks, at what point if Hong Kong does not lift these restrictions, at what point does it risk losing traffic next year? So in other words, the planning cycles for 2023, at what point does this start to impact that? And how long do you think it'll be before the 48 airlines that have left Hong Kong will return to the market?
That's a great question. I can't say that many airlines will return while the uncertainty continues, and committing capacity in an environment where capacity is still constrained, I think would be a difficult decision for many airlines. Hong Kong was always an important market, a critical hub in the region. I think a lot of that activity has now gone to other hubs where restrictions don't apply. And I think it will take some time for Hong Kong to recover. Clearly, a strong hub airport needs a strong hub carrier. So it will be very much dependent on the rate at which Cathay Pacific in particular rebuilds its network. But it is disappointing to see the restrictions continue to restrict the capacity into Hong Kong. Planning cycles, airlines are able to adjust much more quickly today than they used to be able to. But I suspect a lot of airlines will be keeping an eye on Hong Kong, but will be reluctant to commit anything to the market until they see clear evidence that the restrictions are being removed. And more importantly, that the restrictions are being removed and will not be reintroduced, because that's what really is damaging to airlines and to demand in the market, where there's uncertainty around whether the restrictions will be reintroduced. So I think there's some time to go yet for Hong Kong.
Okay, thank you. During the crisis, we'd often talked about a return to 2019 levels in 2024, or even in some cases 2025 for some markets. Given what seems to be happening in the markets today with people living with the pandemic and traffic rebounding, are you a bit more optimistic that the pre-pandemic levels could be reached before 2024?
I'll ask Maury to comment on this in a moment, but my own view is that no, I wouldn't be more optimistic. I think we had talked about 2024 and possibly 2023, but the restrictions that we've seen at some airports have dented a little bit the pace at which we are recovering. So I think 2024 remains an objective view on where we're likely to get back to 2019 levels. But Maury, would you like to comment?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, so there's obviously regional variations around this central 2024 forecast for the industry as a whole. So we would expect the US market to regain the 2019 level in 2023, and then the more closed markets in Asia Pacific, notably China, not to get there until 2025. And so far, even if our forecast changes a little bit on a quarterly basis, it's just a question of a few months to the left or to the right, so to speak, of that. So even those variations would still leave the industry as a whole regaining the 2019 level in 2024.
Okay, thank you. We have a question focusing on Europe, and it's asking about the impact of some of the labor unrest we've seen, particularly at Lufthansa and SAS. So I suppose the question would be, what will the impact of those of labor unrest be, and can you see this spreading beyond Europe?
No, the impact is really not noticeable at an aggregate level. It clearly does have a significant impact on the individual airline performance, but it's not really made significant impact on the market when we look at it. And what tends to happen at times like that is that other carriers will provide some recourse to passengers who are directly impacted as a result of strike action. In fact, you'll see many airlines will come to the assistance of the airline facing industrial action to ensure that customers can be accommodated and can travel, or as many as possible can travel. So it doesn't really impact on the overall levels. I don't see any pattern of behavior at the moment. I think where we have seen issues, you might have been able to expect some of them. You know, we're not seeing any evidence of a change in the environment or any concern that we will see widespread disruption as a result of industrial action.
Okay, thank you. We have a question that's looking ahead towards the autumn period. And the questioner notes that there are several headwinds, I suppose, surging inflation, fuel prices, supply chain issues, perhaps some exchange issues. And the questioner asked, could any of these derail the economic recovery or the industry's recovery? Or do you see other factors that are at risk that we should be paying attention to?
I think these are all headwinds, certainly, but they're headwinds we've faced before. Maybe the elevated crack spread that I mentioned is not something that I can recall seeing. I've certainly seen it higher than that average of 17% through the decade up to 2019. As I said, that is an average, but where we're seeing it now, last week at around 50%, we've seen it over 60%. That's not something that we would normally see or normally see over an extended period. But high oil prices are certainly nothing unusual for the industry to have to deal with, and it ultimately gets reflected in ticket prices. So I think some of these issues we will have witnessed previously. They do tend to have some impact on demand or the pace at which demand recovers. But at the moment, we continue to see strong forward bookings, which is good. The recovery and the pace of recovery has been good. And I think it's clear that many airlines are generating good cash balances as we go through this period and seeking to repair their balance sheets, but strengthening their liquidity. So it's a challenging environment, but I think most airline management teams will be looking at the positives and reflecting on what they need to do to address some of the headwinds that are obvious to us at the moment.
Okay, thank you. We also have a specific question on the impact of inflation and what we would expect that to do for demand for air travel, and I suppose also for cargo.
Yeah, and I'll ask Mari to comment on this. Obviously, if you've been around long enough, you will have seen inflation even at higher levels than this. And you will recall that even in those periods of high inflation, the industry continued to perform well. But it clearly, what we're seeing now is a period of higher inflation relative to what most people would have been used to. I don't think it's impacting on people right now. It probably will as we go forward, and certainly energy prices. If you read the headlines, they will have an impact as we go through the winter period. But Mari, do you want to give a general view from an economic point of view?
With pleasure. Yes, and I will take this opportunity to also loop in the unemployment rate. So this is also an unusual phenomenon. Just as the high crack spread is, the unusual situation is that we have still very low and falling unemployment rates pretty much around the globe, in spite of the fact that economic growth is slowing down, certainly from the 2021 figures that we saw. So it's sort of a job-rich economic slowdown in contrast to the jobless economic recovery that we had after the global financial crisis. one would obviously expect this to change at some point in time. But for now, these unemployment rates are still falling. Jobs are still being created at an incredible clip in many countries. Europe is at its lowest unemployment rate since the euro was created, and many individual countries are setting historic lows in terms of unemployment. So whilst, of course, inflation will reduce the purchasing power of those wages earned, it's more important that more people are earning than the impact of inflation on consumption at this current junction. So that's very supportive and should mitigate any fears of a major recession, as many of us can read in the media that's obviously on people's minds. And inflation is also a bit of a silver lining for anybody carrying debt, because as inflation reduces the purchasing power on wages earned, it also reduces the real value of the debt that has to be repaid, and thereby also reduces the real cost of servicing that debt. So that's also a silver lining in this context that I think is of benefit to us all, given that households, sovereign states and corporates all have higher debt levels, but perhaps in particular also something that's a mild positive for the airlines in particular.
Okay, thank you. We have actually a couple of follow-up questions concerning employment. The first one is asking about recruitment levels at airlines and airports, and the question specifically is, will we have enough people for the busy year-end travel season, or will we see a repeat of July?
No, I don't expect to see a repeat, and certainly from the conversations I've had with airline CEOs, none of them have expressed concern around levels of employment or crewing staffing levels that they will need as they go through the rest of the year. So as I said, I think the recovery took some by surprise, the pace at which it recovered. As I've mentioned before, I think the time it was taking to get people back into the system, particularly given the security checks that needed to be carried out, was not something that had been factored in. The general, as Mari said, the general environment for employment is very strong. So everybody's competing for talent, but I'm not hearing any concerns being expressed about levels as we go through the rest of the year and then into the peak Christmas period.
Okay, thank you. And we have a slightly more specific question focusing on pilots. The questioner says that ALPA says that there's no issue with a pilot shortage, yet it seems that U.S. regional airlines are struggling. Specifically for you, Willie, what's your view on the current situation?
Yeah, I think it is fair to say that regional airlines do appear to be having challenges. We're seeing quite a lot of regional jets grounded at the moment. So I think the ability of the regionals to recruit or to retain pilots in the current environment is a challenge for them. Certainly the major airlines don't appear to be having any difficulties recruiting and retaining pilots. And I think it's a specific challenge for the carriers based in the US. It's not an issue that we're seeing in other parts of the world where there continues to be a strong supply of pilots. Speaking to CEOs who are recruiting, they've said they've had no challenges getting quality and numbers applying for jobs where they are recruiting for pilots. So I think it's a particular issue, as we know, relating to the requirement for commercial pilots in the US, which doesn't exist in other parts of the world, a minimum of 1,500 hours before they can fly on a commercial aircraft. That qualification, as I said, is unique to the US, doesn't apply in other parts of the world. And as a result, I think the challenges that the regional carriers are facing there is specific to what we're seeing in North America.
Okay, thank you. We'll stick with US issues for a moment. We have another question concerning 5G implementation in the US. And the questioner asks, if the FAA has given any response to the airline concerns about its timetable for 5G retrofitting of aircraft.
So we continue to monitor this very closely. It is of concern to us because we're not yet satisfied that all of the modifications can be done in time to meet the proposed deadline. So it's not just the airlines that need to address this. Clearly, we need the manufacturers to produce the equipment as well. So it is being kept under careful review at the moment. We clearly don't want to see the problems we witnessed as we approached the deadline previously. So we're doing a detailed analysis of the supply of the replacement parts that are required and the pace at which modifications are being undertaken so that we can be more comfortable as we approach the deadline. But I have to say at the moment, we don't have sufficient evidence to be able to support a view that everything will be done in time. So it is something that we will be continuing to discuss with the FAA and other regulators in relation to this issue. It should never have occurred. Let's be clear. We avoided the problem in other parts of the world. I think it's a pity that we have had to deal with this challenge, especially at a time like this. And adding uncertainty is not going to be helpful to anybody, but we will keep the situation under close scrutiny.
Okay, thank you. We'll change continents and move to Africa. We have a question about blocked funds. And the questioner asks if IATA is reassured by Nigeria's move to release a portion of the blocked airline funds.
It's a positive step. It is important, however, that airlines have confidence that they can recover funds. It's one thing getting some of the money that has been blocked. We need to see the airlines get all of the money that has been blocked, but more importantly, the airlines need to know that going forward they will be able to repatriate their cash. Very important in terms of planning cycles. Airlines will be reluctant to commit capacity into markets where funds are being blocked. They will be looking for other opportunities. And if you look at the pace at which the market is recovering, I think there will be a risk to African countries that are withholding funds. Airlines will be maybe incentivized to look at other markets where the recovery is now gaining pace. So we welcome this first step by the Nigerian government. I think it has helped certainly to give some encouragement to airlines, but as I said, they want to see certainty in relation to the situation going forward for them to commit capacity to the market going through the rest of the year and into next year.
Okay, thank you. We'll now switch to cargo. We've got a few questions in that subject area. The first questioner notes that cargo levels have been lower in recent months compared to some seen in 2021. And I guess the first part of the question is that the start of a trend? Are you concerned that a downturn could be in the offing?
No, I don't think I'd be concerned. Like, we are seeing a very good performance from cargo, and you can't keep growing. There is some specific issues that have benefited air freight and will continue to benefit air freight. The disruption to sea freight has certainly been a positive. The cost advantage that air freight has had over sea freight has been an advantage. But it is clear that for some time now, the capacity available, particularly on long haul, has been lower than traditionally would be there because, as we've talked about before, a lot of cargo tends to fly in the belly hold of passenger aircraft, and given the disruption to passenger networks, it's meant that there's been less capacity available in the market. Now that capacity is coming back as airlines continue to rebuild their long-haul passenger network. I have commented before that there is if you like, a structural imbalance between supply and demand when it comes to cargo, because the supply in terms of capacity has been driven very much by passenger growth, which over the past 10 years or up to 2019, was very healthy. So as more passenger aircraft came into the market, and particularly some of the newer aircraft like the A350, 900 and 1000, and indeed 777-300s replacing 747s. These aircraft come with greater cargo capacity. It's been a very important part of the business for all airlines. It will continue to be a very important part, but I think most airlines will be pleased to see the ongoing strong performance of cargo.
Okay. Willie, a follow-up on that question. You mentioned the importance of belly capacity. We have a question which is asking, when do you think belly capacity will be at normal levels?
Yeah, it's probably going to get back to normal in late 2023. As Mari talked about earlier, with the regional recovery, as we get back to the levels of passenger traffic that we saw in 2019, you'll see the cargo capacity belly hold coming back as well. And there has been, as you all know, disruption to the supply of wide-body aircraft, long-haul aircraft, because of problems at Boeing and at Airbus. Some of those appear to be under control now. We would expect the supply of aircraft to start to normalize. But I think we're still a little bit away from having the cargo capacity in belly hold aircraft back to where we saw it in 2019. What is also important is, we saw quite a few retirements, 747s, A380s. Now, the A380 wasn't a strong cargo aircraft. It didn't have a lot of cargo capacity. But as those aircraft will be replaced by smaller but more efficient and more cargo capable aircraft, we'll see that acceleration in the recovery of belly hold capacity. But it's probably going to be 2023 or maybe early 2024 before we see it back to 2019 levels.
And Willie, you were talking about the supply of aircraft. We have a question specifically on freighter aircraft, and they're asking whether what your view is on that market, whether the OEMs are perhaps too optimistic in their forecasts for growing demand for all cargo carriers.
Yeah, I think this is an interesting one. I think dedicated freighters from the OEMs, I think does make a lot of sense. You see some big airlines, big passenger airlines who also have a big cargo business. They will need dedicated freighters to operate their schedules and will continue to take delivery. I think the area where we might express a little bit of doubt would be on the conversions, passenger to cargo. Those aircraft, while good, are not as efficient as a dedicated freighter. When you do the conversion, you don't have the same total cargo capacity as you would if it was built as a freighter. And some of those aircraft, if you look at 777-300s or A330s being converted, they're clearly not as efficient as the dedicated freighters that are being produced or will be produced. So I wouldn't have any direct concerns, because I think there is a business, that there is a market for freighters, and a very important market for freighters, but it's not a market that every passenger airline will dip its toe into. You'll see a number of big airlines, Qatar, Emirates, Singapore, the traditional big cargo operators continue to look at freighters. Air France, KLM have had freighters in the past, have ordered some freighters. I can't see BA looking at dedicated freighters again. They certainly could have justified them through the period of the downturn, but it'll be interesting to see if airlines like that decide to dip their toe back into the market.
Okay. We have a question on developments in Europe. The questioner is asking about the balance between network carriers and low-cost carriers, and is wondering whether for this year, the low-cost carriers have increased their market share compared to 2019. And I suppose, what would that look like into the future if there is a shift? Is it a permanent shift, or will things continue to change?
I think you have to be careful just labeling low cost. I think two airlines have certainly done particularly well through this period, Ryanair and Wizz, in terms of capacity. Now, the financial results are a different issue, but certainly in terms of their growth, both have experienced significant growth through this period, and probably do see the opportunity to gain some market share. I think there's also some concern that maybe some of the smaller regional carriers who haven't benefited as strongly from the recovery could face challenges as we go into the traditional weaker demand period, particularly if we continue to see elevated fuel prices. So there may be further growth opportunities for the likes of Ryanair and Wizz. Most of the other airlines that I would put in the low-cost category, have not recovered their capacity to the same degree or at the same pace as Ryanair and Wizz. So we're seeing some changes in the market, but nothing that I would describe as a radical shift. And it's important to remember that for a lot of the so-called legacy or network or traditional airlines, their short-haul network is very much dependent on the need to provide feed. So it goes hand in hand with the recovery of their long-haul markets. So if you look at Asia, as I said, if traffic between Europe and Asia is only at 38% of where it was in 2019, the feed traffic needed to support that is clearly much smaller as well. So as that market into Asia recovers, you'll see the traditional network carriers recover capacity in their short-haul market. So the dynamics aren't as simple as maybe people would believe, but I think you do have to give credit to both Ryanair and Wizz, particularly their ability to grow at pace through the summer, has been impressive.
Okay, thank you. We have a question on ticket prices. The questioner asks or notes that ticket fares, airfares were high during the summer period, and is wondering whether those high ticket prices are expected to continue through to the busy year-end season.
I think the critical issue, as I mentioned before, is the cost of fuel. You can't avoid that, or the only way you can avoid it is by not flying. That has in the past led to airlines taking capacity out through the weaker demand period of the winter. So I think looking at how the supply and demand scenario develops through the winter will be an important factor into what we see with regard to fares. But inevitably, as I said, if airlines are flying, they have to pay for the fuel, and fuel prices are very high, and that will have to be reflected in ticket prices. Airlines don't have the financial capacity to absorb the significant increase that we've seen in prices. And then, on top of that, we see a number of the monopoly suppliers back to their old habits of trying to gouge their customers by putting increased charges. So the cost challenge that airlines will face continues to be significant, and that will have to be a factor when we look at the fares through the winter period. But as I said, supply and demand is a critical issue as well.
Thank you. We have a question about the relationship between U.S. carriers and those in the Gulf. The questioner notes that there have been some plans announced between Emirates and United for closer ties, and the questioner is asking whether there's a bit of change in the relationships between the U.S. and Gulf carriers following the subsidy spat from a couple of years ago.
Well, there clearly has been, and I'm personally pleased to see it. We see a strong and growing relationship between American and Qatar through the One World Alliance, and now we see United and Emirates announcing cooperation as well. And I think that's a positive development. We've seen change in leadership on the US side as well, but these decisions are based on commercial, they're market-based, they're being taken in the interest of consumers, which is a positive development. So I think we'll probably see more of this. I did say that as airlines rebuild their networks, having relationships with other airlines in terms of feeding traffic to one another becomes more important because there's still quite a lot of parts of the network that have not yet been recovered. So providing options for your customers, if you can't do it directly, doing it through a partnership with another airline is clearly an important development. So this is a change from what we had seen a few years ago, and appears to be a strong positive development for the industry.
Okay. Thank you. There's concern that once we get into the winter season, we'll see an increase in COVID cases. And the question is, do you think if that happens, governments will react differently to what they did during the crisis? And are you concerned that we might see travel restrictions being reintroduced?
I'm not as concerned maybe as some people. I think, I'd like to think at least that governments will have learned from the mistakes that they made. It's very clear, as we said before, all of the evidence shows that these border closures have done nothing to suppress the spread of the virus. It's there, it's not going away, and it will continue to spread. But in most cases, I think people have adapted and are learning to live with it. And in a lot of cases, where there's been widespread availability of vaccines, although people are contracting the virus, the effects of the virus has not been as significant as it was when there were no vaccines available. So the evidence is very, very clear. You go back to the very beginning of this, the experts, the WHO said, don't close your borders. It's not going to do anything. It's not going to be a positive development. So I'd like to think, as I said, that governments will have recognized what they did well and what they didn't do well. I think it's also important to recognize that the financial cost to many governments was huge, given the support that they had to provide to their economies. I don't think many governments will be in a position to continue doing that with the other challenges that are being faced by governments. So everything points to a more reasoned response from governments, but you can't rule out that some governments may react in a different way. But generally, I think we'll see a more reasoned response than we saw last time round.
Okay, thank you. This autumn, we're going to see the FIFA World Cup, and the questioner is asking whether the industry is prepared for the demand increase that is expected around that.
Yeah, I think it is. Certainly, plans have been in place for some considerable time. I know that Doha International Airport will be ready. I spoke with Akbar Al-Bakr yesterday, and he was outlining the plans for opening the extended airport that they have. So the capacity at the airport in Doha, I think, is going to be well capable for dealing with the demand that exists. And airlines have already made sure that they will have capacity to fly people who want to attend the World Cup, to be in place. So I think it will be clearly an exciting tournament. Ireland didn't qualify, so I won't be watching it. We'll see what happens, but I don't anticipate any issues. I know from speaking with my friends in Qatar Airways, they're looking forward to it. They're excited, and they're ready for it.
Okay, thank you. We have a question on business travel. The questioner first part of the question asks how we view the macroeconomic situation and what that could do on demand. More specifically on business traffic, and a more specific question, will it remain structurally weaker than before the crisis?
So again, we have to highlight that when we look at data within IATA, we don't look at the reason for travel, but we do look at the class of travel. So we looked at people who are traveling in economy cabins and people who are traveling in the premium cabins. And what we're seeing is that, premium and economy continues to do well. So the recovery in premium was slightly faster or at the same pace as the recovery in economy travel. As I said, we don't look at the reason for travel, but when you talk to airline CEOs, they're certainly more confident of the recovery in business travel. And it's important to point out that not all business travelers travel in the premium cabins. So I think when people look at business travel, they need to be a little bit more nuanced and look at the difference between people who travel in premium cabins and economy cabins. I don't know, Murray, if you want to comment on this, but certainly the figures that we have seen continue to be encouraging for the recovery in people traveling in premium cabins, international premium cabins. Murray?
Yes, I can only confirm. Of course, the share of economy is greater than the share of the premium cabin travelers in percent of the total. Yeah, so we're about 92%, I believe, for economy in terms of the share, and that has also held steady pretty much over the past year or so. And the question was also pertaining to the macroeconomic situation. So there, I believe that if there are pockets where perhaps Western Europe, some people in the US, where they can cope with flying less and turning more to virtual conferences, I think that those numbers will be dwarfed by the increase in such travel from every other region as soon as such a thing is possible, notably China.
Okay, thank you. We've got about 10 minutes left, so we'll try and go quickly through the remaining questions in the queue. We have one question about Africa. The questioner notes that with the exception of Ethiopian Airlines, growth for most of Africa has stagnated. And essentially the question is, what's needed on the continent to improve connectivity and become more affordable?
It's a great question, and there's been a lot of debate in Africa about an open aviation area to enable consumers to benefit from what they've seen in the deregulated markets in the US, or indeed if you look at sorry,
yep, I think we're back.
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, sorry, I don't know what happened there. So yeah, I think the situation in Africa is more challenging, but I think Africa would certainly benefit from a liberalized environment there, where if you look at the benefits to consumers in Europe or in the US, where we've seen the market deregulate, which has facilitated new entry and facilitated significant growth in new routes being established. But the situation in Africa, I think, will continue to be a challenge. But I'm optimistic. If you look at what's happening there, you're seeing the development of some very good carriers with ambitions around creating hubs in different parts of Africa to serve wider markets than their geographic country, if you like, that they're based in. So if I was looking at Africa over the next 10 years, I would take a very positive view of what's likely to happen in Africa going forward.
Okay, thank you. We have a question about aircraft delivery delays. The questioner essentially asks is, how frustrating is it for airlines for these delays based on supply chain challenges?
To be honest, normally it's hugely frustrating. It's the cost of, real cost and disruption within an airline when you don't get the airline as it was scheduled to be delivered. When you consider that most of the time significant planning will have gone in, training in advance of the aircraft being delivered. When the aircraft doesn't get delivered on time, you have a lot of people trained with nothing to do, particularly with pilots, engineers. So it is very disruptive for an airline not to take delivery of an aircraft. I know there are airlines out there who have desperately wanted the additional capacity as they saw strong recovery in their markets, but were unable to get aircraft delivered on schedule, which is very frustrating. I think there are also times when it can be probably helpful to the airline that they don't get it. So when aircraft tend to be ordered many years before delivery, if the environment changes, like we've seen, you go into an economic downturn, you might not want the aircraft exactly when you planned it. But this is very frustrating, and it's not just about getting it in the year you ordered it; it's getting it on the in the month, on the week, on the date that you ordered it, because that's the way airlines traditionally plan. So when it doesn't get delivered on schedule, extremely disruptive for airlines.
Okay. We have a question about Israel's announced plans to ban quad jets for engine aircraft. The questioner asks, could other countries follow suit, and how disruptive could this be, particularly for the cargo industry?
I have to be honest, I was very surprised. I think it will be disruptive, particularly for the cargo industry. There are a lot of four-engine 747 freighters out there, and many of them have served Israel. I don't think this is going to be replicated by other countries who will take a more detailed view and an analysis of the likely disruption to their markets. It's not in line with what you would expect from countries based on their commitments under ICAO. So I was surprised. I don't fully understand the logic being used to introduce this ban, and I think it's going to represent some disruption for Israel in terms of cargo supply to the market, particularly in an environment where cargo demand continues to be strong and supply generally has been disrupted because of the impact on passenger schedules. So a surprising development that I don't expect other countries to follow.
Okay, we'll try and take a couple last questions. One questioner is asking about the status of slot regulations worldwide. Is IATA satisfied that current alleviations are sufficient, or does IATA need extensions? What's an update on that situation?
So we believe that going into the winter, we're still not back to where the industry was, like just based on the figures that I gave you earlier. So when you consider that international travel is at about 68%, I think it was, of where we were in 2019. Overall, we're at 75%. So the idea that we should return to the normal slot rules 80-20, I think is premature. We are still recovering, but we're not back to where we were. And I think the industry does require further alleviation. It's important to give confidence to consumers that we're going to see schedules planned and operated as they would expect, and that we don't see some of the disruption that we witnessed earlier in this year. So there continue to be discussions with slot regulators and authorities, but hopefully we'll see a sensible approach to this.
Okay, and this will likely be the last question. Willie, several times you mentioned the unusually wide crack spread for fuel. Why is that happening? Is there some contributing factor to that you could identify? And the second part of that question is, do you anticipate that that's a situation that's going to continue through 2022?
So, well, what you're seeing is, certainly refineries are making a hell of a lot of money at the moment. What tends to happen is when the demand for jet fuel declines, and we saw it effectively go to, close to zero through 2020 and slowly recover in 2021, but way below where it normally would be. Refineries switched off the production of jet fuel, and it doesn't, it's not that easy for a refinery to switch back, and change what it's producing. So it tends to reflect the demand for jet fuel and the supply at the refinery for the jet fuel. So as you would expect, if there's strong demand and limited supply, then the crack spread will widen the way it has. But I think there's also clear evidence that there are refineries there who are making a hell of a lot of money in the current environment. So our hope is that these people will reflect on what it is they're doing and turn their attention to reducing sustainable aviation fuels, which will be needed for the future growth of the industry.
Great, thank you very much. I think that's all the time we have for questions today. So with that, I'll thank all of the participants, those who have joined us for this press conference. I appreciate there are a few questions left in the queue. We'll go through those, and if you've identified yourself, we'll try and get back to you with a comment. If not, please don't hesitate to email us at partcoms@iata.org, and we'll do our best to respond. Thank you very much for your participation. One event that I guess I would draw everyone's attention to would be at the end of the month. We've got the ICAO Assembly, where we will have some important issues on environment being discussed. So we'll probably come back to you around that time with an overview of our environmental issues in a press briefing similar to this. So thank you again, everyone. Have a good rest of your day and good rest of the week.